There's a very curious phenomenon when you actually enter government. You have a whole series of interviews, and I remember the Independent asked me, wanted to ask me 20 questions. And one of the questions was, do I drink bottled water, or do I drink even fizzy water? And having been pre-warned by my excellent office, I said absolutely not. And then they asked me, did I believe in God? I pondered that, and then I recalled the Dalai Lama had once been asked if he believed in reincarnation. And his answer to that I thought was superb. He said, that's my own private business. So that, in fact, was how I answered the Independent on that. So let me move into this. I'm going to give you a slightly gloomy lecture with, I hope, a little bit of optimism and the odd occasional reflection. I think it's really, that we're in the 21st century. I don't think it's really recognised how enormously determined the time path of the 21st century is going to be. There's three things. Clearly there are enormous changes which will happen, political and economic and so on, which are not predictable. But there are some things that really are going to be happening. And the first one, and I'll focus on each of these in some measure later on, but the first one is population. We know there will be another billion people by 2025, give or take. Beware spurious accuracy. It might be as early as March 2024 or as late as September 2026. But give or take, you're going to have another billion people on the planet. That's the first thing that's happening. And demography is not going to change. Just to give, on that, you will get epidemics, you'll get and so on. Biggest epidemic ever that we, in modern times at least, was following the First World War with the Spanish influenza outbreak, and that killed about 100 million people. But essentially, it will be hardly noticeable in the inexorable change in population that we're having, and hopefully we have better ways of dealing with it. So that's one thing. The second one is urbanization. 2010 was the first year that the urban population exceeded the rural, and that's going to continue. This is a trend that is just unimaginable and is going to be significantly reversed. I'll deal with that later. And the third one is less understood, and I'm going to elaborate in quite a bit of detail. But because of the time delays in the climate system, what the greenhouse gases in the upper atmosphere at present will determine our climate and therefore our weather for about 20, 25 years in the future. And there's a couple of other things that are happening. Despite enormous poverty, there is a growth in the developing world of what you might call a burgeoning middle class, and that will actually increase consumption as that happens. So those are the sort of three or four things that are actually going to have to happen, and these are going to happen, and they're going to happen on a very fast timescale, essentially 12 years away as we look out to 2025. So let's go to population in some detail. The table on the right points to the sort of changes that we've seen in population. 2011, I believe the date that they reckon that 7 billion population was reached was something like the sort of 27th of October in 2011. Manifest nonsense. It clearly wasn't the 27th. It might have been the 20th, or indeed well into November. But ignore spurious accuracy. The second is that, and you can see that the 8 billion is expected when this particular slide was developed. 13 years ago, 12 years hence, we must expect another billion people on the planet. And as the graph shows, that is going to be very unequally distributed. Give or take, that extra billion people is 500 million in Africa and 500 million in Asia. And in Africa, the change will be completely dramatic, because the current African population is about 1 billion, and it will increase in 12 years' time by 50%. In Asia, currently it's about 4 billion, so the increase, albeit in absolute terms, is going to be substantial. It's not going to be anything like as dramatic in the effect of the overall population on the Asian continent. So that's population, and you can see also effectively constancy in most of the rest of the world. Minor increases in North America, minor increases in South America, and some decreases in Europe. So that's population. But the second issue is urbanization. As I indicated, 2010 for the first time saw the urban population exceed the rural. Expected, as we project later into the century, that to actually dominate, and indeed there's a lot of evidence to indicate that 2010-11 was actually the peak of the rural population of the world, and it will continue to decline. Not to say there's not going to be major problems of development, but that is there. Looking at the urbanization, this is a sort of flavor that you can get from the box, a city of 1 million people every 5 days for the next 40 years. And to put that into a parochial term, in Africa, the expectation is that the 500 million additional population will be in about 1,000 cities of 500,000. Give you a flavour, in 12 years' time there'll be 1,000 cities the size of Edinburgh, and that's in Africa. This is a dramatic change that we're going to see in Africa. In Asia, something similar is going to be happening. The only difference in Asia is that the cities will have an expectation of being near 1 million rather than 500,000. So that's a second major trend. The third one was alluded to earlier on by speakers, to do with actually something that's rather good in terms of longevity. Longevity is increasing with development, which is as one is expected, but actually it poses some fairly significant problems. And if you look at the bottom right-hand graph, which shows the sort of changes in the number of people aged 65 or over, you're looking at an enormous increase in that in the developing world. So that development of increased longevity is great, but actually it brings with it an enormous increase in the vulnerability of the elderly. And of course, as Karen mentioned, there's significant issues to do with the vulnerability of children. So those are some of the things that are just going to happen. There may be minor variations about it, but that actually is really going to pose it. And the urbanization comes with some real issues. This is the expectation of looking out to 2025 of where those urban agglomerations are actually going to occur. And the red on the map is the big ones and the larger the dot. And you can see that there is a very substantial change in pattern. And by and large, and I think that really is quite important, is that these things are these urban agglomerations will be actually around the coastal regions. And I think that that's one of the things that we need to be thinking about in terms of the other key issue, which is the vulnerability to climate change. And that's what I want to move on to next. There's a lot of debate about climate change. It's very strange because people feel they can comment on climate change, which is an enormously complicated phenomenon involving millions of different observations with sort of simple commentary. I remember once characterizing this sort of commentary as saloon bar science, in which people look out of the window and say, God, it was cold yesterday, what's all this global warming about? This saloon bar science has got quite a lot of sway in the media in particular, and unfortunately it's fundamentally nonsense. Let me illustrate this for you a little bit. There's obviously big uncertainties in climate change. The models are complex. One doesn't have much ability to predict exactly what is going to be happening in large parts of the developing world, or indeed in Britain. But let's think about the anomaly. Let's look at this one. This is the anomaly, which is the difference shown red when it's positive, i.e. the temperatures are higher, or blue when they're lower, on the land masses of the world. And this is taken in 55, 65, and 75. You start to see some things that the scientists, meteorologists have predicted, slightly more red in the northern Canada, slightly more red as you move towards the Arctic. But by and large, that's the anomalies we saw what is now almost 40 years ago. Not much change, but let's look at the last 6 years. And the phenomenon is completely dramatic. These anomalies are showing that, and these are not single observations. This ain't saloon bar science. This is millions and millions of observations on temperature throughout the world. And you can see, if you look at the top row, actually, if we're looking 40 years ago, there were things to be detected, there was some more warming, but if you look at the last 6 years, it is completely dramatic. And so when you get articles in the media saying, oh, climate change, it's all to do with whatever, apart from anything else they want to say, you know, this is scientists are saying this is happening because that way they'll get more research grants and get papers in Nature and they will get promotions, and this is all nonsense and it's conspiracy of meteorological and climate sciences. That's the sort of allegation. But this sort of fundamental data is quite difficult to fiddle several tens of millions of observations which went into this particular graph. One of the interesting counters to this conspiracy theory about science is to actually go to business. Now, one of the largest reinsurance companies in the world is based in Munich, and they have been monitoring, for obvious reasons of their business, the changes in disasters, which they are insuring, over the last 40 years or so. Now, there's a difference between these disasters, and I'm afraid, my apologies, the key is off here, but the red is essentially geophysical events, earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanoes, and the like. No real trend in the red on that. But the ones that are actually determined by weather and climate are the green, the blue, and the yellow. They're differentiated. My apologies, I don't have a decent key on that. And as you can see, major increases in the climate-related and weather-related disasters. And remember, this is not scientists sat in Birkbeck College or Cambridge or Oxford or the Met Office who are doing this to increase their grant income and ensure promotion. This is Munich Re, massive reinsurance company, and they come up with it. And the World Economic Forum also pointed to the sort of increases in catastrophes that are actually occurring. Now, it doesn't prove it, but it's indicating that it is not just the scientific community that's taking it seriously, and the business community is taking it enormously seriously, and properly so. But we have a real problem. We have a real problem in the sense that what one needs to see is an international, legally binding agreement that somehow agrees that the emission of greenhouse gases needs to be cut back substantially. And I'm afraid there's been a series of what I would characterise as failures in government. You say sort of minor successes because you spin it slightly, but I think these are quite clearly failures. Copenhagen was an acknowledged failure, but there is some progress. And the last meeting in Doha in 2012, there is some agreement between the parties, but at the moment, there is agreement they will have some form of binding agreement by about 2020 and so on. The problem is twofold. One is, will it happen? But secondly, and I'll come back to that in a moment, is the time delays mean that this is really presenting us with big problems. But let me move on. This is the current projections. Sorry, it's a complicated graph, but the line with all the dots around, with all the squiggles around, is real observations and projections. And one of the things that was agreed at the international discussions, but they want to agree, and that was agreed by the international community, that we would aim for a 2-degree increase and no more. The projections are, is this going to happen? Almost certainly not. And let me give you some of the examples why I don't think it will happen. This is coal and gas. Let me just focus on the satellite picture first of all. This is a picture taken from a satellite showing the light that has been emitted from very large cities in the American continent. And the top left, which is labelled as in North Dakota, is actually the burning of waste shale gas. Now, shale gas you'll all have heard of, potential problems with the environment, but this is shale gas that is just being burned off because actually it's now, the price has dropped, so it's not worth much money, and they're collecting oil, which is significantly more. And as you can see, that is in one formation in North America, and it's producing a light picture quite similar to really quite substantial cities like Minneapolis and Dallas. And we've got a second anomaly, which is at the top right, is the way in which climate change operates geographically is that a lot of climate change is expected to be in the Arctic. There are lots of reasons for that, mainly due to the physical composition of the oceans and the movement of major phenomena like the jet stream. But what we're seeing is really big changes in the Arctic, and actually those changes which effectively involve the melting of sea ice is opening up the Arctic for enormous amounts of hydrocarbon exploration. So again, it points to a fact that I found really nervous, that economic forces will mean you're not going to get that global agreement, and if you do, I think it can be eroded. And final one is coal. The blue shows the reserves of coal in the world. Enormous reserves of coal in the world here, in North America, in Australia, in Russia, and in China, in part in India, in South Africa, in South America. These enormous reserves of coal, I cannot believe that they're not going to be used. I find it very hard to believe decisions will be taken. We've got this in the ground, it's relatively cheap technology, no, these won't be used. So I have I fear, cynicism that we are not going to see agreements in a short time. Let me go back and leave you with that picture for a second, because the real problem is the speed. I mentioned very early on that what is up in the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere affect weather in about 20 years' time. So the weather patterns we're experiencing in the last few years come from the greenhouse gas emissions that were in the atmosphere in the 1990s. And they are weird. They are quite dramatic, the changes that we've actually observed. And so with that time delay, if we think now what's up there, there's been an awful lot more greenhouse gases have gone into the atmosphere since the 1990s. With a 20-year time delay, it's saying that what's up there now, 2013, is going to be determining climate out to at least 2030 or so, 2035. So the weather has been determined, and if we think that the international community is going to fail to reach agreement for another 10 years, what we're talking about is that climate and hence weather is going to be determined out to really the middle of the century already. Does it matter? Well, the first thing is, and I'm sorry, this is rather a mathematical slide, but it's very simple to explain. Basically, for every parameter you measure, whether it's temperature or precipitation, these issues are increasing. Temperature's going up, rainfall is increasing for simple physical reasons, but the key here is the variation. The variation is going up at double the speed of the mean. What does that mean? It's sort of typical mathematical ecology jargon. Actually, what it's saying is that the world is going to get weather is going to get vastly more variable. So there's going to be more and more droughts, more and more floods, more and more heat waves, more and more cold spells. So the variation that we've observed is really rather important, and that's what presents a problem. Just to give you an example. This is something from Texas. All the blue points are the last 100 years' data on the relationship between temperature and rainfall in Texas. 2011, as you can see, is way outside the 100-year pattern. And it's difficult to attribute a particular event because weather is a complex and stochastic random phenomenon. But the analysis is saying, well, if you actually look at it, they found that the chance of that sort of phenomenon that was observed in Texas is increased by about 20-fold by the fact that climate change has been happening. So this is the thing to worry about. And there's other ones to do with the way in which our Earth is affected. There's a nice lesson to hear in the top right-hand graph is how you can make something look dramatic by having your x-axis in millions of years. You can make the current 5 years look really quite exciting when you have your x-axis denominated in millions. But actually, it's a serious phenomenon that the simple chemical interaction between carbon dioxide and the ocean means the oceans are getting more acidic. And this will have knock-on effects for the livelihoods. For example, coral reef provide a significant amount of protein for about 1 billion people. Now, all those are the challenges, and we're not starting from a very good place. If we think about the three elements that Jeff referred to in the idea I generated a few years back, we've got a big issue of food security. Give or take around about 1 billion people go hungry, and another 1 billion people suffer from hidden hunger, insufficient nutrition, the world population increase. So there's a real issue of food security. There's a real issue of water security. Give or take, around about 1 billion people lack access to decent quality water supplies. And energy security, which is not really focused on much. It's about a little under 1.5 billion people don't have sufficient electricity and will still lack access to electricity in about 15 or 17 years' time. So that's the current situation. And the state of play really isn't good. This graph in this slide almost repeats what I've said. You've got poverty, you've got weather, you've got hunger, you've got water availability, but also you've got a history, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But there's been big problems of the way that historically the world has been treated, resulting in land degradation and waste. And I'll come on to some of those later on. The dilemma, of course, is that if we try to address poverty, as you solve the poverty problem and people increase their per capita income, then that increases their consumption of energy. The left-hand thing is quite noisy, but the trend done by a colleague of mine, David Mackay. But food consumption and meat consumption, all of those increase with per capita income. And summing it up, food, water and energy, these are the sort of gaps we've got. This is what the top left shows the demand, how it's going to increase in terms of energy as we see a burgeoning and developing world. Demand for energy in the OECD is pretty much constant over the period that we're looking at. In the developing world, it's soaring. So there's going to be a real issue of providing energy. And if you provide energy in conventional ways, using, for example, coal or other hydrocarbons, you're going to shove up greenhouse gases. Demand on water is very substantial, and we're looking, if we look out as short as 2030, 17 years away, you're talking about a 40% shortfall in what would be a reasonable expectation of demand, let alone the erosion of the poverty that we're seeing. And I've just illustrated the food issue, pointing to two major cereals in which simple extrapolation of increases in yield, which have been successful, mean that we're going to have a significant shortfall in the unless changes increase yield in terms of the production of food for people. So to sum it up, and this is a cheerful lecture, isn't it? This is looking out to 2030. Another 1 billion people, many more people living in cities, a more prosperous world will meet, which is good, but it's far from homogeneous, and there is still enormous pockets of poverty. We've got a complex demographic trends. There is a migration, I haven't covered that, but some study that was done by my Foresight team looked at the effect that migration is likely to have, and a lot of migrants are actually not moving to areas of safe from environmental hazard, but actually moving into it, and climate change is happening. So the bottom thing says it, we need by 17 years' time about 30 or 40% more food and water. We need about 50-odd% more energy, and if emissions continue as they're going, with no intervention, they're going to go up by about 40%. And remember, because of the time delays, if by 2030 those emissions have gone by 40%, you're going to see weather patterns that are dramatically different from now. The weather we're experiencing now is determined what was in the upper atmosphere in 1990. Imagine what the weather patterns are going to be like if you follow that trajectory as we move out to the 2050s and 60s. So as I say, cheerful little lecture. Let me go on, what about it? And what about the past? You know, we have lived with a very substantial increase in the human population. There is, of course, poverty, there are things, but actually there's been a real failure in the way that we've actually dealt with natural resources. And I'll go through these things quickly because I'm conscious that everybody's going to need a cup of coffee after this lecture. So the first one is degraded land. The level of degradation in land, about 24% of land that would be used for farming has been degraded over the last 30 or 40 years or so, and the map shows it. So that's land, that's degraded soil, soils that can't produce anything like what was their original potential. People are well aware, of course, of overexploitation of forests, been probably the most publicised in the media and to the general public. But big problems of actually in forest depletion, I must say, somewhat slowed recently. And biodiversity, in all the indices of biodiversity are getting worse. So as we've developed, we are seeing a decline in all the measures of the plants and animals which we share the planet with. And final one, an area I worked in, is that our increase in production meant that many of our fisheries are unsustainable, and that the management of our fisheries are really pretty. The red is the worst management of fisheries, and the green is the best. And I slightly defy you to find too much green in this particular graph, which is the management of way we actually deal with fisheries. And water is an enormous problem. Let me just take you to the top left-hand portion of this slide. The red is overexploited aquifers, and the green is the ones that have already gone saline. And to give you a flavour of that, in northwest India, water coming from aquifers that is used for irrigation is sometimes as much as between 300 and 400 years old water. The level of overexploitation of aquifers that's been occurring over the last 40, 50 years, actually quite often by subsidies, well-meaning subsidies of local farmers, means that we've got massive overexploitation. By I've talked about in terms of 500 million more Africans, and in fact some recent studies by the UK Geological Survey and others have shown that there are actually quite substantial sources of underground water in Africa. That could be a fantastic potential for that continent, but if it isn't managed, and you can see the failure of management in the Indian subcontinent, we have a real problem. There's ways of doing that now. And to give you an idea of the unsustainability of some practices, this is from Saudi Arabia, where they're growing water in the desert around the aquifers. And as you can see, I think the sustainability is arguably debatable. But there are going to be other areas, and we need to be thinking about managing this. And the other one I want to point out is waste. Give or take, 30 or 40% of the world's key crops for food are lost prior to the end of farm gate, and another 30% or so are lost in storage. That's the developing world. In the developed world, as the top left graph shows, give or take 30 or 40% is actually wasted after purchase. So one of the, forgive the pun, but low-hanging fruit here is that if one could actually significantly erode waste, either through pests and diseases in the developing world or changes in human consumption patterns in the developed world, you have a real chance of actually thinking about significantly improving food production without anything absolutely massive in terms of land use change. But diseases are a problem. It's a slide that I find quite frightening. This is the new diseases of animals and humans that have appeared over the last 50 or 60 years. And the colleagues from the London School are well aware of this, but we are seeing a big increase in which new diseases appear, whether they're of animals or plants. And the top right hand is indicative because that's the pattern of air travel. I was involved in dealing with the swine flu epidemic. In 1 month it had moved from being in Mexico to being in 46 countries. That is to do with largely international travel. And we're going to be seeing these, and in agriculture we're seeing more pests, agricultural pests increasing at the same rate, and in our animals and in humans. And since this slide was developed, we've got the coronavirus problems, and we're actually seeing a new strain of influenza, which links in bird flu, rather different strain, which seems to have a much closer potential for transmission between humans. So this is not going to be easy, and that's one of the challenges. But I think I'm going to end quite quickly on now, but I think the message is the future that cannot be like the past. We need to alleviate poverty. We need to meet the demands of growing population and urbanized population, but we need some sustainability. I'm going to go through these quick. First of all, biotechnology. For some bizarre reason, there is a view in parts of the world, parts of the community, not shared much beyond Europe, that somehow biotechnology, if it involved genetic modification, is not going to work. There was the Rothenstedt, one of the government research labs, used a peppermint gene to insert into the wheat gene, produced a pheromone which was the alarm pheromone with aphids, which means they avoided the wheat plants, meant they weren't eliminated from the ecosystem, which they would have been by spraying, available for predators and other insects. And we had a movement which tried to completely stamp it out and tried to say this is threatening the world. It is arrant nonsense. There are perfectly sensible concerns about genetically modified organisms. You need to be certain they're safe for human health. You need to be safe for the environment. You need to have tests on it. But the idea that all GM modifications are removed, and the developing world, can be a real problem. Europe is mad in this context. Europe has legislation and a political process which means essentially almost nothing has happened. The rest of the world are using it. And I think that a very interesting article co-authored by Chris Whitty, who is the chief scientific advisor in DFID, pointed to the fact that I think there was a phrase in the article saying, don't let the madness that is in Europe affect your decisions on development in the developing world, because there are real issues that you've done. Golden rice is a classic, but there are many other ways that you can actually use genetically modified organisms that will genuinely help development. And of course there's been problems in the past. The IP has got to be centrally available. It cannot be in companies, and so that intellectual property has some value. This has got to be given to the world, and actually that's the sort of thing that I hope to see. And it's not just GM organisms, it's biotechnology more generally. But that's the high-tech side of it. But there's lots of smart things that can be done in terms of actually thinking about how we solve these problems. The rice intensification that's been developed for example, in Vietnam has enormous benefits, and those of you who want to can read into this. Big potential there. Agriculture and aquaculture. There's a good example in the Philippines where actually having rice systems which actually have fish can massively increase productivity and actually the income that rice farmers can actually get from their plants. And there's some really interesting things to do with thinking about agriculture in a way that it not just is a problem generated by climate change, but having an agriculture that actually can address these issues and, for example, sequestered carbon dioxide. And these are some of the examples in which different techniques will use, less fossil fuels, and also actually involve a sequestration of these. And there's a real potential for what we might call climate smart agriculture. And sadly enough, when this was raised in the Durban meeting of the international parties dealing with climate change as a real potential for an initiative, it didn't get through. Completely saddening, because if we used agriculture in the way that we've historically done and meet the needs for food, you're going to massively increase greenhouse gas production. And there's potential for renewable energy. It doesn't always have to be hydrocarbons, and we know that from Oran. But some very interesting developments in small hydropower in a whole series of countries in this. So there's smart things we can do. So there's some positive things that we can do, and it's positive in the development context. And it's going to need not just scientists and engineers, but it's going to need social scientists. These things need acceptance. They need mechanisms for actually ensuring distribution is equitable, and distribution is not at the expense of social change, which actually is detrimental to large portions of the population. So what about 2030 onwards? I'm only depressing you up to 2030. Wait till I go to 2050. There's two things that really worry me. Climate change I've talked about. I think that we are looking towards greenhouse gas emissions that are actually going to drive climate change, and it will get worse. And even if the interventions are coming, we're probably looking out to 30 years ahead. But the one that is really, I think, quite scary is demography. Now, there's 3 lines on the top right-hand graph. The central one is the sort of best bet, as you were, of what population is going to do, and as you can see, some degree of plateauing. But it really depends on what actually happens, and it depends almost entirely on female fertility. Now, we do know, and many of you in the audience know vastly more about this than I, but we know that almost all studies point to three factors that affect fertility in women. One is education. The duration of education of women is enormously well correlated with the decline in fertility. The other one is prosperity, and so obviously addressing poverty will help. And the third one is the availability of contraception. Now, there are enormous social issues involved with all of these three, but if you don't, and the middle line is not much more than, I think, an educated guess on the assumption that things will get better, so you look to some form of flattening. If you don't, and some parts of Africa, for example, still talking about 7 or 8 children per female, you have a real potential of actually not getting that flattening of world population, but actually increasing it. And nothing much is different from those trajectories out to about 25. So I think we have some time to address these issues. And I think that looking at demography, looking at the ways one can actually have interventions which will actually slow down population growth, I think is an underused and under-assessed problem. But if you don't have it, and you move towards that upper graph, the problems that are all there with urbanization, with diseases, with climate change, are going to be exacerbated. It's going to be tough enough unless you address that problem. And I'd emphasize again, it's prosperity, it's the education of women, and it's the availability of contraception. And I think the key thing in demography is you have time delays, just you do in the climate system. We need interventions that are actually really going to help that over the next 15 years or so. Otherwise, you're likely to be at a tipping point where population will really start to increase because it will feed on itself. Big increase in population is likely to reduce prosperity, and therefore is also going to reduce female education because these things tend to be correlated. So that's the last tipping point. Now, as I say, I normally try to give speeches like this just before the drinks interval in the evening because everybody feels like going for a drink afterwards. But now you have a chance to ask me a couple of questions and then we'll truncate that and then we go for some coffee to sort of say, oh, well, it's not really as bad as it said, is it? Okay, thank you for your attention. The key thing is that the scientific community should not be overclaiming. It should be indicating that there are uncertainties where there are uncertainties and play it completely straight. And I think that the key here is that you should challenge. When you get this saloon bar science, I think the scientific community needs to actually challenge it, point out that it's nonsensical and actually do it. Now, as you indicated, there's enormous financial resources going into the support of the climate skeptic movement. I think to an extent that will continue and I don't think you can combat it, and I think there is some degree of safety in the status quo. For example, in the UK, albeit we have climate skeptics who are extremely vocal and write in the media and actually stuff which is primarily nonsensical from a scientific point of view. But actually we have a Climate Change Act which was agreed by all parties. That Climate Change Act says that we will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 34% by 2020 and 80% by 2050. It's an act of Parliament, all party support. I think it's unimaginable that will be repealed. I may be wrong, but I very much doubt it. So in a sense, government policy, it almost may be akin to some of the issues where the general population may be in support of a thing, but their elected representatives are not. So I think to some extent, the focus, you need to make certain that this sort of stuff is challenged, but I think you need to challenge it in an open way. More internationally, I think that one of the, there was a major election in the USA, and President Obama on his election said there were two things he wanted to look in his second term. One was poverty alleviation, and the second was climate change. So, in a sense, the democratic process, I think, is one of the sort of balances against what is very, very well funded lobbying against it. And I think the mistake would be of the scientific community to overclaim. Claim certainty where it isn't. Try to have the high ground. Have transparency. Don't try to hide. And it is terribly frustrating. You know, the freedom of information requests that are going into various government organisations like our Met Office or universities that are working on these areas are such that you have to develop a lot of resources to answer what are leading or at times fatuous questions. But there's no way. That's the democratic process. So I don't think there's an easy answer. I think that one of the things that one needs to be pondering, and it's an interesting question, is should Mark Walpert debate climate change with Nigel Lawson? I don't think he should, because Mark Walpert is the Chief Scientific Advisor of the United Kingdom. Nigel Lawson is an ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer who works for an organisation. I don't think it's appropriate. It's a sort of dignifying of the debate. So the people who should be, in a sense, dealing with this are those pressure groups from the other side, rather than the science. And I think the science has got to keep this straight. It's got to say, this is the evidence, these are the uncertainties, and this is that. And I think that's probably the way to go. I think there is a real problem, and I think it's sort of specific to the UK in terms of whether we can meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals without nuclear, and I actually don't think you can. That's a technical thing. I think there's also an issue to do with, I believe, an overemphasis on the dangers of radiation. And I think that there is a lot of emotion around radiation for understandable reasons. But one of the jobs I did when I was in government was after the tsunami and earthquake and tsunami in Japan and the disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. I was asked by the cabinet to actually advise on whether we should move our expatriates or move our embassy. And we did all the analysis, and actually the answer came out unequivocally no problem. I made a terrible error there, incidentally, because I said the amount of radiation that you're going to get in Tokyo, even in the worst possible case, you know, all the reactors going up and the wind going in that direction, would be about equivalent to eating about 40 bananas. And then I've been persecuted ever since by the banana importers who said that I've ruined their business. These things, so, you know, I could have done it worse, because I could say it's like having a long holiday in Cornwall, and then I would never dare go to Cornwall again. But I think there is an overemphasis of these problems. And I think one of the things that I found very saddening recently was that the World Health Organization produced a very detailed report on the effect of radiation in Fukushima province. And it was very clear that really the amount of radiation was such that you would not even detect increases in cancer rates or child stillbirths and so on. And this was denounced by Greenpeace, I think, as clearly a political statement in favour of the nuclear industry. And this was a WHO 40-person study. That's the sort of thing that, you know, that needs to be fought against. But I never saw anyone contradicting that, whether whether a WHO statement or indeed the scientific community. So I think that there is assertion. It generates a lot of emotion, but the idea of that, in a sense, radiation is going to threaten the world, just the evidence isn't there. The number of people who died after Chernobyl, which is acknowledgedly the worst thing, is about 100. It's not hundreds of thousands, which is claimed. And there's a very detailed epidemiological study by a professor at Imperial College and looked at that. There were some immediate deaths of the order of 30, but very brave people who tried to address the fire and put it out. And then there's some deaths that actually come effectively from residual effects on, radioactive iodine and so on. But it's under 100.
But is it a long-term solution if we get over the emotional aspect? I
think it is. Yeah, it depends how long-term. I think that the current nuclear technology is such that key thing is safety, because obviously, I can talk all I want about how radiation isn't that dangerous, but nobody's going to believe me if they've got a nuclear power station next to them. So you need to appropriately address those fears. And I think we're needing to think about sort of next generation power stations, which actually will be safer. And ultimately, I think we have hopes for some form of fast breeder reactors, which will have less waste. We have not really solved the waste problem, but there are technologies that are being developed to do that. And ultimately, we hope to have some form of fusion power in 30, 40 years. It's interesting in terms of the overall energy case, is that I was very worried that shale gas was going to be seen as an environmental cause célèbre. The NGOs are so good at this, aren't they? They're so much better than anyone else that to have an organisation called Frack Off guarantees coverage in all the newspapers, doesn't it? You know, you've got some sort of nice-looking young people with a large banner and Frack Off guarantees front-page coverage. But in fact, I got the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering to do a detailed study of the environmental impacts, and they basically came up with saying sensible regulation means they're not going to be a problem. But shale gas is not the solution to the rest of the century, but it probably is 20, 30 years will help the economy and so on. So it's complex, and where the mix is. And of course we should be developing renewables. And I think that it's not a zero-sum game, which some claim that the money we put into nuclear is guaranteeing, means that we don't develop renewables. This is just not sensible.